cycled air across my neck that carried no warmth, and I marked it in my intake log the same way I marked everything I could not explain, as a variable awaiting assignment. My designation within this facility was Chirurgeon Auditor, 3rd Cadre, seconded from Bastion Medicae Division 7 to Ordo Xenos Sub-Facility Umbral for the duration of a single shift cycle. My orders were specific and brief. I was to observe, measure, and certify the physiological viability of a captured Xenos specimen. I was to produce continuous notation. I was to submit my records in full at the conclusion of my assigned period. I was told nothing more than this, and I understood that the brevity of the briefing was itself a form of instruction. The sub-vault was not large, but it had been made to feel smaller by the density of apparatus within it. Servo skulls drifted in a slow circuit near the ceiling, their cranial lenses oriented downward, their autoquills scratching at scroll feeds attached to their jawbones. Recording equipment lined the walls in tiered brackets. The floor was a single, unbroken surface of gray composite, and in its center, suspended within a frame of reinforced adamantite struts and luminescent filament restraints, was the subject. I had reviewed the classification brief during transit. Eldari strain, Drukhari subcategory, high threat, extremis handling protocols, standard contamination wards, warded seals, psi-null emitters at 4 corners of the chamber. I had read these designations in the same way I read all such categorizations, as the beginning of understanding, not its conclusion. My job was to complete the data, to add physiological readings and behavioral certifications to the administrative skeleton the Ordo had already constructed. The Drukhari did not look like what the brief had prepared me for, or rather, it looked exactly like the brief had described. But description had failed to anticipate the quality of its stillness. It was suspended at approximately chest height, both arms held laterally by the filament restraints, its torso angled slightly forward. Its body was lean to the point of architectural. The joints were precise, the proportions elongated in a way that suggested deliberate refinement rather than natural variation. Its armor had been removed, replaced by medical binding fabric that covered the torso and upper legs. The skin beneath the bindings and at the neck and hands was pale, without being translucent, and entirely unmarked. That was the first thing I recorded in my notation pad. No visible trauma, no bruising consistent with capture, no sutured lacerations, no healing abrasions, no residual swelling at the restraint contact points. For a specimen brought in under extremis protocols, this was unusual. I noted it without interpretation and moved on to baseline physiological markers, respiratory rate, estimated cardiac rhythm by chest movement, oculomotor status. The eyes were closed. An attending functionary of the Ordo, designation withheld, stood at a control lectern to my left. I had identified him as an interrogator by the rank sigils on his collar. He had not spoken to me since the entrance seal closed. He stood with both hands flat on the lectern surface, watching the suspended figure with an expression I could only describe as studied patience. I continued my baseline notation. I was midway through a secondary assessment of the subject's skin condition when the secondary door opened. 2 Ordo enforcers brought in a second individual, male, adult, civilian build. I had been given no information about this person's identity or status, but the clothing identified him as a hive laborer of middling tier, and the restraint binders on his wrists were the standard pattern used for non-combat detainees. He was uninjured. He was frightened. His breathing was already irregular, his eyes moving rapidly between the Drukhari and the door through which he had entered, as though calculating distances. No one spoke to him. He was positioned at the far end of the chamber, within a containment field boundary marked by floor-level emitters, and the enforcers withdrew. The interrogator still did not speak. I looked at the Xenos subject. The eyes remained closed. The hive-ganger began to make a sound. It was not a sound I had heard before in precisely that form, though I had been present at many procedures involving distress responses. This sound did not build incrementally from silence. It began at a specific intensity, fully formed, as though the person had been mid-scream and the audio had simply been re-engaged. A scream without preamble, without escalation, issuing from a person who stood untouched, uncontacted, and visually uninjured. The Drukhari's eyes opened. I recorded this. I recorded the precise moment of the correlation, because correlation was not causation, and my notation had to be exact. The subject opened its eyes at the onset of the secondary subject's vocalization. Or, possibly, the secondary subject began vocalizing at the moment the primary subject's eyes opened. The time margin was too narrow for manual notation to resolve, and the servo skulls would capture the precise frame differential. I wrote what I could observe. The interrogator finally moved. He turned his head toward me and said, in a voice that carried no more inflection than a status report, that I was to document physiological responses in the secondary subject. I was to note all deviations from baseline without attribution of cause. I was to maintain notation continuity throughout. I moved to the secondary subject's containment boundary. He was standing. He was screaming. There was no injury. No device was visible. No field emitter had activated. Nothing in the room had changed except the alignment of the primary subject's gaze. The hiveganger's body was beginning to show secondary responses to sustained distress, diaphoresis, elevated carotid pulse visible at the throat, increased lacrimation. These were consistent with extreme psychological distress, and I recorded them as such. Then the skin on his forearm began to change. Not damage in the conventional sense, not laceration or burn. The change was subtler and therefore more difficult to categorize. The surface of the skin appeared to be undergoing something for which I had no clinical precedent in that moment, a kind of displacement, as though the tissue were being organized differently without any apparent mechanism of reorganization. The hiveganger continued to scream, and the scream had no ceiling, no point at which it peaked and began to decline. I recorded every visible change. Blistering inconsistent with thermal cause, muscular distortion inconsistent with exertion, internal displacement suggested by abdominal contour change inconsistent with voluntary movement. I wrote what I saw in the clinical language available to me, and the clinical language began to fail around the edges of the observations. But I kept writing, because the act of writing was what I had been assigned to do, and the assigned function was the anchor against which nothing else could be weighed. The Drukhari watched with an expression that I recorded as measured interest, because that was the closest available notation. It was not pleasure in the performance sense. It was not what I would have called satisfaction. It was the expression of a technician observing a process that was proceeding within expected parameters. An expression of confirmation. The secondary subject died while still producing sound. I completed my documentation of the deterioration sequence. I noted the absence of observable mechanism throughout. I noted that the Drukhari had not moved, had not produced any emission visible to my instruments, had not accessed any apparatus, and had not made physical contact at any point. The interrogator reviewed my notation scroll and told me that the demonstration was deemed successful and that I was to prepare for extended observation. I prepared. The screaming, which should have ended with the subject's death, continued for a further 11 seconds. I recorded this without explanation because there was none available. I was not yet at a point where the absence of explanation was itself an explanation. That threshold was still ahead of me, and I could not see it from where I stood. The subvault's cold settled deeper into my coat. The servo skulls continued their circuit. The autoquills scratched. I had accepted the role of recorder. I had not been asked to understand. There were catechisms for circumstances like these. Not exactly for these circumstances, but for the category of circumstances in which a servant of the emperor encounters that which appears to exceed the boundaries of sanctioned knowledge. I had learned them during my Medicae certification, interwoven through the practical instruction on tissue repair and organ stabilization, appearing without announcement in the margins of technical training, as though they belonged to no specific chapter, but to all of them simultaneously. The relevant fragment was brief and precise. All phenomena observed in service to the Emperor are ultimately reducible to cause and mechanism. The Xenos does not possess mystery. It possesses only concealed mechanism. The role of the Imperial servant is to locate the mechanism and remove the concealment. This was doctrine. This was not difficult to believe when the phenomena in question were unfamiliar pathogen strains or non-standard weapons effects. It was also not difficult to believe in the aftermath of the first observation, because the first observation was already recorded and the record had given it a form, and forms could be analyzed. The documentation existed. The event was therefore categorized. The category was labeled incomplete pending further analysis, and incomplete pending further analysis was a sanctioned state of understanding. It had a place within the system. It did not invalidate the system. The Bastion supported this interpretation through its architecture. Everything within sub-facility Umbral was designed to transform uncertainty into procedure. The sub-vaults were numbered. The corridors were labeled. The specimen logs used a standardized classification system that had entries for every known Xenos strain and provisional notation fields for behavioral anomalies awaiting category assignment. When I walked from the observation chamber to the chirurgical alcove assigned to my use during the extended observation period, the route was marked by illuminated directional indicators, and the walls were stenciled with operational designations. The facility knew where everything was. The facility would eventually know what everything meant. The Drukhari had been returned to its restraint frame between the first observation and my preparation period. I passed the chamber's exterior monitor station and saw its telemetry feed still active, the vital sign readings I had been provided as a certification baseline still registering within the expected ranges for the species. Slow cardiac rate, reduced respiratory cycle, body temperature below human standard. These were known. These were on file. The Xenos was categorized to this extent. It was identified in the facility's operational ledger as Specimen 7 of Record Series Umbral Sigma. The classification line read, Drukhari, suspected warrior caste, captured during pacification action, sector designation redacted. Everything after that was procedural notation. Containment requirements, handling restrictions, study authorization status. The study authorization had been signed by someone whose signature block was present, but whose identity designation was replaced by an ordo sigil. This was not unusual. Authorization signatures at this classification level were routinely anonymized. I prepared my equipment for extended observation. New notation scrolls, calibrated calipers, a portable cogitator linked to the facility's medical data cache, standard chirurgical instruments for the stabilization role I had been assigned. The work of preparation was itself a form of catechism, the physical ordering of tools, a reaffirmation that the work to come would be ordered as well. Each instrument had a designation. Each designation corresponded to a function. Each function corresponded to a procedure. The procedure would produce data. The data would produce understanding. This was the sequence. The fracture I had noticed in the first observation was small. The absence of observable mechanism was a gap, not a contradiction. Gaps were expected at this stage. The note I had made in my primary log, no mechanism observed, was followed immediately by a secondary notation in my procedural shorthand that I had learned to use as a form of professional self-correction. Further instrumentation required. This meant that my current equipment and training were insufficient to detect the mechanism, not that the mechanism did not exist. This was an epistemological distinction I had maintained throughout my career. It was productive. It was necessary. It was also, I should record, entirely comfortable in that moment. What troubled me more than the mechanism question was a sensory detail I had not yet catalogued in my formal notation because it did not belong to any recognized category of relevant observation. It was this. The silence in the chamber between the secondary subject's vocalizations had not been silent. It had possessed a quality I was reluctant to assign any notation to, because notation implies category, and I had no category for what the silence had felt like. It felt inhabited, not by sound, not by vibration, not by anything I could locate. Simply inhabited, as though the acoustic space of the room had been occupied by a presence that was not audible. I suppressed this observation in my formal record because it was not documentable. A chirurgeon does not record atmospheric impressions. A chirurgeon records data. I filed the sensory anomaly under the same mental designation I had used for the mechanism gap. Further instrumentation required. The extended observation cycle began with the arrival of an interrogator, a different one from the individual who had overseen the first demonstration. This one was younger, or appeared younger. with the compact efficiency of movement that indicated long service in confined operational environments. He carried a data slate and reviewed my intake notation without expression, scrolling through the scroll feed images at a pace that suggested he was checking structure rather than reading content. He informed me that my assignment had been expanded. I would remain for the duration of an extended shift cycle, rather than the single period originally specified. The shift cycle duration at this facility was not synchronized to standard Terran hours and was defined instead by operational parameters. I would be informed when my shift had concluded. He did not invite response. I recorded the instruction in my log and confirmed compliance. The new interrogator departed. I was escorted to the primary observation chamber by a facility servitor and resumed my position at the notation station. 3 new subjects had been introduced. I had not been present for their placement. They occupied individual containment field boundaries arranged in a triangular configuration within the chamber, each field boundary marked by floor emitters of the same pattern as those used in the first demonstration. Each subject was adult, male, civilian profile, in apparently good physical health. Their behavioral state ranged from flat affect in one to sustained hypervigilance in the 2 others. I performed a rapid baseline assessment and recorded their initial physiological parameters. The Drukhari had been repositioned. Its restraints had been partially released. The lateral arm restraints were still active, but the torso and leg bindings had been loosened to allow limited movement within the frame. It stood upright now rather than hanging in extension, and its posture had changed. In the first observation, it had been entirely static, a subject waiting to become active. Now it was active in a way that was difficult to describe precisely because activity usually implies motion, and it had not yet moved. It was present in the chamber differently. The distinction was not observable by any instrument I was carrying, and I was therefore unable to record it in standard notation. It looked at the 3 subjects in turn, a slow traversal that paused at each individual. I noted this. I recorded the duration of each pause. The pauses were not equal. Then it began. The subject in the first containment field began to exhibit what I would classify, in the absence of better terminology, as a euphoric response. Laughter. Not nervous laughter, not the distress-adjacent vocalization that can accompany extreme fear. Laughter of the type associated with profound positive affect, with joy or the anticipation of something deeply desired. This subject laughed, and continued to laugh. And the laughing did not stop, as his body began to respond in ways that were entirely at odds with the emotional register his face was displaying. The physiological deterioration I observed in him was severe and progressive, and the sound he was producing throughout was laughter. I documented this as a dissociation event without identified cause. The second subject began to beg. Not for release, not for mercy in general terms. He begged for death with the specificity of someone who had experienced something that had made continued existence worse than termination. He was entirely uninjured by any visible assessment. There was no wound, no mark, nothing that should have been causing the level of distress he was expressing with the word please, repeated, exhausted, stripped of everything except the consonants by repetition. The third subject was silent. The third subject's eyes were open very wide and remained fixed at a point approximately 1 meter above the floor in the space between himself and the Drukhari. He did not move, did not produce sound, displayed no vocalization at all, until the point at which his vocal cords ruptured from what I was later forced to classify as internal strain, specifically a sustained involuntary constriction of the laryngeal musculature without extrinsic cause. None of the 3 subjects had been contacted. The Drukhari had not moved from the frame. No device had been introduced, no field activated, no environmental parameter altered that I could detect. I was writing continuously. My notation scroll was nearly full, and I reached for a secondary without pausing my observation. The act of reaching, of the physical continuation of the recording function, was the only thing in that chamber that belonged entirely to a framework I understood. I held on to that. The Drukhari turned its head and looked at me while I was writing. I recorded the duration of this attention, 4 seconds. I recorded my physiological response as a measurable elevation in cardiac rate, which was appropriate for the circumstances and consistent with proximity to a high-threat specimen. I did not record the specific quality of the attention, which was not the attention of an animal regarding a threat and not the attention of a person regarding another person, but something that I associated afterward. Without satisfaction, with the attention of a craftsman appraising material, I looked away first. This was not fear. I recorded it as a positional adjustment for notation purposes. The second observation cycle ended. The three subjects were in various states of deterioration, all still technically viable by the margins I had been instructed to maintain as my certification thresholds. I began drafting my preliminary notation summary. In the process of drafting, I noticed something. The Drukhari had approached each of the three subjects in a sequence, and the suffering each subject experienced was different, specifically different, as though calibrated to the individual. The euphoric deterioration in the first subject was not a universal effect. The second subject had experienced something distinct. The third had experienced something else entirely. This was not random variation. I had worked in Medicaid long enough to recognize random variation in response to trauma stimuli, and this was not that pattern. The differences were too consistent with each individual's intake behavioral profile. The Drukhari had assessed them during those first pauses. The different durations of assessment had corresponded to the complexity of the response subsequently induced. I wrote this down. I wrote it as a preliminary observation with a notation flag indicating that it required verification across additional data points before any conclusion could be drawn. This was the correct procedure. This was a methodologically sound flag, but I had already concluded it. The conclusion existed before the flag. I had applied the flag retroactively to give the conclusion the correct procedural dress. Nothing about that procedure had felt dishonest. That was, perhaps, the thing I should have noted more carefully. The third cycle began with the Drukhari being provided implements. The accompanying notation from the oversight desk indicated that these were implements of Xenos manufacture, recovered during the same action that had resulted in the subject's capture. They were described in the facility's materials log as monomolecular edge tools of unknown specific function, assessed as surgical in probable application. They had been inspected by the Ordo's materials catalogers before introduction into the chamber, and the inspection notes indicated no weaponized function identifiable by standard assessment. They were not weapons. They were tools. The Drukhari received the implements on a sterile field tray without reacting to them, in the way that a practitioner does not react to the sight of familiar tools. Not familiarity in the sense of recognition, though obviously recognition was present. Familiarity in the emotional register of ease. This is where these objects belong. This is their correct relationship to my hands. A single subject was brought in for this cycle. I did not recognize the subject as any of the three from the previous cycle, and the intake profile I was handed listed this individual as a separate detainee of undisclosed origin. The subject was positioned within a single containment field in the center of the chamber, and the Drukhari was permitted to approach. What followed was the most difficult observation I had yet been required to perform, not because of the severity of what occurred, though severity was present, but because of its logic. I had been trained in chirurgical and Medicaid procedures. I had performed and assisted at major surgical interventions. I understood the internal architecture of the human body in the detailed, functional way that a person who has spent years maintaining it understands it. I watched the Drukhari work on this subject, and I recognized what it was doing. Not all of it, but enough. It was operating, not in the destructive sense that the term might suggest in this context. It was opening the body with the specific purposeful economy of motion that distinguishes a practitioner from someone simply applying force, and it was exposing structures within that body, and it was arranging those structures. The subject was conscious throughout. The subject's nervous system was intact and fully engaged throughout. The subject did not die. The last part was the one that required the most notation space. The subject did not die. Every intervention I was observing was calibrated by a logic I was reconstructing in real time from the observable outcomes to preserve the subject. Not to preserve the subject for future use in the way that the Ordo preserved subjects for further study. To preserve the subject in a specific functional state, that was the evident purpose of the entire procedure. The Drukhari was not trying to learn something from the subject. It was not extracting information, not testing tolerance thresholds for data purposes, not conducting an exploratory procedure to map unknown anatomy. It was optimizing the subject toward a particular condition, and the particular condition it was optimizing toward was one in which the subject would remain alive, remain aware, and remain in the precise quality of distress that the Drukhari found most useful. It was tuning an instrument. I was watching an act of maintenance. An interrogator entered the chamber midway through this procedure. Not to observe, or not only to observe, he spoke to me. He informed me that my role was to be supplemented with a stabilization function. I was to assist in ensuring the subject's continued viability throughout and after the procedure. I was to apply standard stabilization techniques as directed by facility protocol, monitoring the subject's cardiac and respiratory status and intervening if either fell below the threshold values specified in the notation I was given. I confirmed the instruction. I moved to my assigned position adjacent to the subject. The Drukhari did not acknowledge my presence or my role in the way that a human practitioner might, but it also did not obstruct me or alter its approach. It worked around my stabilization function the way a senior practitioner incorporates a subordinate into a procedure without redirecting attention. There was an assumption that I would perform correctly. There was no communication of this assumption because communication was unnecessary. I was expected to know my function and to perform it. I performed it. My hands were occupied with monitoring equipment and stabilization protocols. I was doing what I had been trained to do, maintaining a person's vital function within acceptable parameters, preventing organ failure, regulating the cascading physiological responses to ongoing trauma. This is what my training was for. The fact that I was doing it in the context of preventing a premature end to a procedure that should have ended the subject's suffering was a contextual variable that the training itself had not addressed, because the training had not anticipated this particular context. I noted an improvement in the subject's cardiac stability following my first intervention. The improvement was consistent with correct application of the stabilization protocol. I had performed the function correctly. This was noted in my log as a positive outcome metric. On the fourth phase of the observation cycle, the Drukhari spoke to me. The Ordo had informed me, in a brief attached to my extended assignment notification, that the subject was capable of producing lingua technis approximations and had demonstrated familiarity with Low Gothic phonemic structures, though it had not yet addressed the interrogation staff. The brief noted this as a behavioral choice on the specimen's part, not a capability limitation. It had been choosing silence. It chose not to be silent with me. The voice was not what I had anticipated from the body. It was unhurried and precisely pitched, the way a sound can be when its producer has complete conscious control over every aspect of its production. It spoke in Low Gothic, accented but articulate, and it spoke about what it was doing, not about mechanism. I want to be precise about this, because the distinction is important to everything that followed. It did not explain how it did what it did. It did not offer the physiological or biological or whatever other substrate would have housed a mechanistic account of its methods. It spoke only about what it intended and about the relationship between intention and the state it was producing. It used the word threshold repeatedly. It spoke about the distance between what was survivable and what was not, and the value of the territory within that distance. It described this territory not as a zone of pain, but as a zone of clarity, a state of biological consciousness that existed only under conditions that threatened to end it. It said that most practitioners of its arts worked imprecisely, reaching for termination too quickly, wasting the available range. It said this with the mild disapproval of someone discussing a technical shortcoming in a peer. It did not address any of the interrogators who were monitoring from the external station. It directed everything it said to me. I did not know why it had chosen me as its interlocutor. I did not ask. I continued to perform my stabilization function. I continued to record. At one point it paused its narration and looked at my notation. It looked at what I was writing with the same assessing quality of attention it had directed at the subjects before beginning its work on them. I experienced this attention and noted the experience, specific, not diffuse observation, directed evaluation. It said something that I initially recorded phonetically because I was uncertain of the translation, and then transcribed more carefully when I had time to reconstruct it. What it said, approximately, was this: that I already understood the logic of the threshold because I had just demonstrated it in my stabilization work. That the technique I had applied was functionally identical to what it was describing, the same principle enacted through different means for the same purpose, sustained vitality at the point of maximum productive stress. I wrote this down. I flagged it for contextual correction, meaning I added a notation indicating that the claim was a subjective comparison made by the subject and did not constitute an accurate characterization of Imperial Medicae protocols. I filed the flag and continued working. The subject's vitals stabilized further. My technique was producing the intended result. I adjusted my monitoring parameters to ensure I would not intervene again prematurely. There was a range within which the subject's status could fluctuate without requiring my action, and I recalibrated my response threshold to the wider end of that range to allow more margin before intervention. This decision was procedurally sound. A narrower response threshold would have produced unnecessary interventions. Efficiency required wider margins. I noted the adjustment in my log. I did not note what I was adjusting toward. Between the 4th and 5th phases, I was permitted a rest period in the facility's designated personnel alcove. I consumed the ration provided, reviewed my notation scrolls, and completed my interim documentation for submission to the oversight desk. The overhead lighting in the alcove was standard issue, a warm amber tone used throughout the Bastion's personnel areas, and I sat under it with my scrolls and my cogitator and functioned as a professional reviewing their work. This is what I did. I reviewed what I had recorded and verified the accuracy of each entry against my memory of the events. At no point during this review did I identify an error in my documentation. Each entry reflected what I had observed. Each observation had been recorded correctly. The sum of the correct observations formed a picture that I now recognized was not aligning with the doctrinal framework I had brought into the facility that morning. The doctrine said, the Xenos is aberrant, its cruelty is excess, indulgence, the behavior of a species that has abandoned the discipline of survival. The Drukhari specifically was categorized in every academic treatment I had access to as a race consumed by excess, whose practices were psychologically driven in the human sense, motivated by pleasure-seeking and depravity. What I had observed was not excess. What I had observed was not indulgence. What I had observed was precision, a level of technical mastery that was not consistent with a creature acting from compulsion or appetite. The Drukhari had, in 3 observation cycles, demonstrated a degree of calibration in its methods that I was professionally unable to describe as anything other than skill, developed over extensive time, applied with evident purpose. The doctrine had a provisional note for this category of observation: insufficient data. Apply standard classification until sufficient data permits revision. I applied the standard classification in my documentation. The standard classification was: subject exhibits predatory behavior consistent with known Xenos profiles. Deviations from expected parameters noted for study. I noted them for study. I submitted my interim report. The 5th phase began with the arrival of a familiar subject. I recognized the individual when they were brought in because I had performed stabilization work on them in an earlier phase, and the stabilization work had required close enough physical proximity to create a strong visual memory. This was the individual from the 3rd cycle, the one on whom the Drukhari had performed the extended procedure, the individual I had assisted in sustaining. According to the facility log entry I had reviewed, this subject had been declared non-viable at the conclusion of the 3rd cycle and removed for standard containment. The standard containment designation for non-viable subjects in an active Ordo study was holding stasis pending disposition. I had assumed disposition meant termination. The individual standing at the entry point of the chamber was not dead. Not stasis preserved, not in a state of suspended animation. Standing, ambulatory, and dressed in the same facility binding fabric as other subjects, but altered, The alteration was visible in posture, in the way weight was distributed across the standing body, in the quality of the eye's focus, which was present but organized around something that was not in the room. I recorded. Subject from Cycle 3, previously designated non-viable, returned to observation status. Physical condition: ambulatory. No visible acute injury. Behavioral state consistent with ongoing dissociation. The Drukhari was brought in. The subject collapsed. Not fell, not fainted. Collapsed with the totality of a structure losing its load-bearing function, all at once, as though the vertical orientation of the body had been dependent on something that the Drukhari's entry had removed. The subject was on the floor and convulsing before any action had been taken, before the Drukhari had reached the center of the chamber, before it had given any indication of intent. The Drukhari stood and observed the collapse with the same technical attention I had noted in every other phase. Its expression had not changed. Its interest was the same. It had done nothing. The subject continued to convulse for 7 seconds and then became still. The subject was alive. I verified this from my position, and the monitoring readout confirmed it. The subject was alive, on the floor, and the convulsion had produced no apparent physical injury. The Drukhari crouched and examined the subject without touching it. A close, slow examination. I was recording all of this. My notation was continuous. My pen was moving. The act of writing was performing its usual function, the function of transforming what I was seeing into a form that could be filed, indexed, and thereby placed at a proper distance from immediate experience. But the distance was not holding the way it usually did. The space between what I was observing and the framework through which I was categorizing it had been narrowing since the first phase, and it had now narrowed to a point where I could no longer pretend that the categories were containing the observations. The subject had collapsed because of the Drukhari's presence. Not because of anything the Drukhari had done, because of what it was, and because of what it had already done to this subject in the previous cycle. The procedure in the third cycle had altered this person in a way that persisted. The alteration had created a dependency, or a vulnerability, or a residue, some form of continuing relationship between this subject and the entity that had worked on them, and that relationship had just expressed itself as a physical collapse in response to proximity. The cruelty was not in the act. It was in the continuity. This thought arrived fully formed, and I wrote it down exactly as it arrived, in the space between 2 formal notation entries, in handwriting that was less controlled than my usual documentation. I wrote it, and I did not add a flag for contextual correction. I left it there between the 2 formal entries, an uncategorized note in a clinical record, and moved on to the next entry. I would not be permitted to move on from it. But I did not know that yet. The restricted archive access was not something I requested. It was something I was given as an extension of my observation function by the interrogator who delivered my assignment parameters for a later phase. He told me that in order to perform an accurate certification assessment, I would need context from prior Drukhari encounters, and that a selection of relevant records had been cleared for my review. A data wafer was placed beside my notation station. I accessed it. The records were not recent. The earliest was dated several decades prior, from a different sector, following a large-scale Drukhari incursion on an agri-world. The reporting Ordo Attaché had compiled behavioral observation notes from survivors of the raid, alongside the standard damage assessment and population loss figures. I read the behavioral notes. The survivors described an experience that did not map cleanly to the conventional account of Drukhari raids, which in public documents and militarum briefings was characterized as unprovoked aggression, mass abduction, and systematic atrocity. All of those elements were present, but the survivors were describing something beneath those elements, a quality to the experience that persisted after the physical events had ended. Several described persistent physiological states, inexplicable sustained distress, chronic pain without injury, a relationship to their own bodies that had been altered. One survivor described the experience of having been used, not physically in the ways that word typically implies, but experientially, as though the experience of their suffering had been a resource that was being drawn from them, The Ordo Attaché had noted these accounts and then, in a separate notation, had recorded that they were psychologically consistent with severe trauma and should not be interpreted as factual accounts of mechanism. I read the next record, same conclusion, and the next. Across 7 separate incident reports spanning 4 decades and 3 different sectors, the Ordo's processing machinery had produced the same categorization. Subjective survivor accounts indicating persistent altered states, classified as trauma-consistent and non-evidential. Each time, the behavioral observations that did not fit the standard account were handled the same way, noted, labeled as non-evidential, filed. The filing was thorough. The archive was well organized. Every report had a case number, a sector designation, an outcome summary. The summaries were tidy. Worlds raided, populations taken, survivors found in altered states, areas cleared and reconsecrated, life returned to standard operation. What the summaries did not address was the question of why, not why the Drukhari had raided, because that was covered under the standard categorization of Xenos predation. The question the summaries did not address was why the pattern of the raids was consistent with a specific operational objective. Why the populations taken were taken in the specific condition they were taken in. Why the survivors were left in the specific state they were in, rather than being killed or taken as well. I read 7 reports, and the pattern was present in all of them. The Drukhari did not kill indiscriminately. It took what it came for, processed what it took in a specific way, and left the remainder in a condition that was not accidental. The remainder, the survivors left behind, were not collateral. They were a byproduct, a waste stream from an industrial process. This was the point at which I understood. Not fully, not immediately, but the understanding arrived in a way that was specific and irreversible, the same way a diagnostic conclusion arrives when the symptoms have passed a threshold of correlation that cannot be attributed to coincidence. The Drukhari's activities were not raids in the military sense. They were not attacks motivated by territorial acquisition or resource control in the material sense. They were harvesting operations. The resource being harvested was suffering itself, not metaphorically, physiologically, biologically, at whatever level of mechanism I did not yet have access to. The suffering of other creatures was something the Drukhari required for its continued function, its continued existence. The raids were not cruelty for its own sake. They were a feeding mechanism. The precision I had observed in the chamber was not the precision of sadism, it was the precision of nutrition. A practitioner who can sustain a subject at the point of maximum productive distress for the longest possible duration is not exhibiting technical sadism. It is being efficient about resource extraction. The cruelty was not chosen, it was required. I held this conclusion in the space between the archive data wafer and my notation pad for a period I did not track precisely, and then I wrote it down in the same spare, clinical language I had been using throughout. Because the clinical language was what I had, and the clinical language could hold almost anything if you stripped it down to observable reference and avoided attribution of cause. I wrote, "Evidence across multiple incident records suggests that Drukhari behavioral patterns during incursions are consistent with a resource extraction model in which the suffering of subjects functions as the extracted resource. This model is consistent with observations from the current study cycle. No mechanism identified. Pattern consistency across 7 independent records suggests non-coincidental structural function." I read this entry twice. Then I tagged it with the same provisional flag I had been using throughout the study. Pending verification, further data required. But the flag was cosmetic now. I knew it when I applied it. The conclusion did not make what I had observed more terrible. It made it more coherent. And coherence, even of a terrible thing, produces a specific response in a trained intellect, the relief of understanding. The horror of what I now understood was real, but it was cleaner than the horror of incomprehension had been. I had replaced an incomprehensible anomaly with a comprehensible system, and the system, however repugnant, was something I could work with, could document, could certify. What I had not yet done, what I was not yet ready to do, was apply the same analytical framework I had applied to the archive records to the operations I had been participating in within this facility. I was not ready to ask what was being produced in the sub-vault, and for whose benefit, and whether the Drukhari in its restraint frame was the subject of a study or the practitioner of one. That question arrived on its own schedule. It arrived during the 6th observation cycle, when I was performing stabilization work on a subject in the 2nd phase of the Drukhari's attention, and the Drukhari said to me, in the same unhurried, precise low Gothic it had used before, "You are learning the technique correctly. I want to note that for you." I was applying a pressure bandage to a point of external strain in the subject's thoracic region. My hands were occupied. I continued the application. I did not respond to the Drukhari. It continued. "The approach you used in the 3rd cycle, the threshold adjustment to the response parameters, that was correct. Most of your practitioners would have intervened earlier. The adjustment allowed for a more complete yield." I completed the bandage application. I moved to my monitoring position. I recorded the subject's vital status. The Drukhari was correct. I had adjusted my response threshold. I had done it for reasons that were technically defensible. It had produced a result that the Drukhari was characterizing as a more complete yield. I had not thought of it in those terms. I had not assigned the word yield to what I was doing. I had been performing stabilization to ensure subject viability for continued observation. Stabilization was a Medicae function. It was in my authorization profile for this assignment. It was what I had been told to do. But I had adjusted the threshold without instruction. I had made a choice about when to intervene and when not to, and the choice I had made had aligned with the Drukhari's operational methodology. Not because I had been instructed to align with it, because I had looked at the results and made a calibration. I reviewed my notation from that cycle. The entry read, "Threshold adjustment to response parameters for efficiency, clinically sound, no deviation from protocol requirements." No deviation from protocol requirements. This was technically accurate because the protocol specified a range rather than a specific point. I had operated within the range. But within the range I had moved toward one end rather than the other. And the end I had moved toward was the end that the Drukhari would have moved toward. I left the notation as it was. I did not amend it. The memory of that decision is not something I can precisely locate within the larger sequence of the study. It sits within the record as a procedural notation, accurate in its technical details, and it did not feel like a significant moment when I made it. It felt like a small efficiency adjustment made by a competent professional in the course of a complex assignment. The gap between what it felt like and what it was would not become clear to me until later. By later, of course, I mean after the memory sanction. What remains now is incomplete, and the incompleteness is not uniform. Some things are absent entirely. Others persist in a form that is less than specific, a residual pattern rather than a discrete memory. The pattern of that adjustment persists. In the 7th cycle, the isolation phase, I was in the chamber with a Drukhari and a single subject, and the monitoring station outside had gone dark. No servo skull circuits were active. The wall-mounted feeds were offline. I had received no instruction for this transition, and no explanation followed it. The chamber was still lit by its internal luminators, but the oversight apparatus had been removed from the equation without announcement. I was aware of the absence. I recorded it. External monitoring offline, no directive received, maintaining observational function pending restoration or instruction. The subject in this cycle was someone I had not seen before, introduced just before the monitoring went offline, sitting within a containment field that was still active at the floor level. The Drukhari was at the chamber's center. It had not moved toward the subject. It was standing, and the subject was sitting, and nothing was happening in the visible sense, but the subject's baseline profile was shifting in a direction I could read from my portable monitoring equipment. The deterioration was beginning. The pattern was the same as the others, though the quality of this particular iteration was quieter than those I had observed previously. Not euphoria, not begging, not the silence of the 3rd cycle subject, something more like erosion. A slow flattening of the baseline readings across multiple parameters simultaneously, moving toward a threshold that I recognized. I had my stabilization equipment. I had not been instructed to intervene. I had not been instructed not to intervene. There was no instruction. There was only the chamber, the subject, the Drukhari, and my equipment. I looked at the subject's readings. The readings were entering the lower margin of the intervention range I had been using throughout the study. I looked at the Drukhari. It was watching the subject with its characteristic focused attention. I looked at my notation pad. Then I looked at the readings again, and I noticed that my response threshold, the one I had recalibrated earlier in the study for reasons I had documented as efficiency related, was set to a wider margin than the standard protocol would have specified. The readings were within the standard protocol's intervention range. They were not yet within my adjusted range. I waited. The subject's readings continued to erode. The erosion was slow and steady. The Drukhari had not moved. No visible mechanism was active. The process continued at the same pace it had been continuing when I first began observing it. When the readings crossed my adjusted threshold, I intervened. I applied the stabilization protocol. The readings stabilized. I recorded the intervention as applied standard stabilization at threshold crossing. The threshold I had recorded was my adjusted threshold, not the standard protocol threshold. The intervention had been delayed by the distance between them. I recorded it as standard. It was not standard. I had not been instructed to use a non-standard threshold. I had chosen to do so on an earlier occasion and had continued applying it without review. The Drukhari did not comment on this cycle. It remained silent throughout. It did not need to speak. The process was proceeding without instruction, without oversight, and with my participation, and all of that had been accomplished without a single direct order. I completed my notation for the cycle and sat with it for a moment in the silent chamber. The realization that arrived in that silence was not the worst of what I had understood in this facility, but it was the one that most directly concerned me. The others were about the Drukhari. This one was about what I had become over the course of the study. I had been introduced to the process as an observer. I had become a participant at the point of the stabilization instruction, which was a sanctioned transition. I had then continued to adjust my participation in incremental ways that aligned the substance of my actions with the Drukhari's methodology while maintaining the appearance, in my own documentation, of standard procedure. I had done this without compulsion, without instruction, and without, at any point, identifying what I was doing as something other than professional competence. The Drukhari was efficient because suffering was its sustenance, and it had optimized its methods over a very long time to maximize yield. I had become more efficient within this study, and the direction of that efficiency had moved consistently toward the Drukhari's methodology, and I had not questioned the direction. I had used the word efficient to describe both of these processes in my notation. This was the point at which the doctrine I had carried into the facility lost the last of its functional authority over my understanding. Not because I had reasoned my way out of it, because the evidence of my own documentation was that I had already been operating outside of it for a measurable period without registering the deviation. The doctrine had not failed under philosophical pressure. It had failed under the weight of what I had actually done with my own hands. What was unacceptable was that I could not, at that moment, identify the specific point at which the transition had occurred. I submitted my preliminary findings to the oversight desk at the beginning of the next scheduled reporting interval. The findings were organized in the standard format: observation summary, behavioral analysis, physiological data tables, anomaly notation, preliminary conclusions. The preliminary conclusions section was where I had placed the framework I had developed over the course of the study. I wrote it carefully, in the same clinical language I had used throughout, stripped of direct implication while maintaining the logical structure that would allow a reader with the relevant training to reconstruct the implication independently. I was writing for a reader who would know what I meant without my having to state it in the terms that would make it impossible to suppress. I concluded, in summary, that the Drukhari's behavioral patterns throughout the observation cycles were inconsistent with the standard categorization of Xenos predation as psychologically motivated excess, and were instead consistent with a functional, biological model in which specific physiological responses in subject organisms serve as a resource necessary for the Drukhari's continued vitality. I noted the absence of identified mechanism. I noted the pattern consistency with historical records. I noted the calibration and precision of the methods as evidence of a structured and optimized system rather than impulse-driven behavior. I also noted, in a subsection that I understood would be the first thing reviewed and the last thing retained, that the absence of observable mechanism meant that the process might not be amenable to standard suppression protocols. That containment of a Drukhari specimen within a facility where subjects were present might represent an environment in which the specimen's operational function could continue regardless of visible restraint. I submitted the report and returned to my alcove. The response came within 1/3 of a shift cycle. It was delivered not by the interrogator who had been managing the observation phases, but by a different official, one I had not seen before in this facility, wearing no rank sigils and carrying a data slate with no visible content. This person informed me, in a tone devoid of any evaluative quality, that my preliminary report had been reviewed by the relevant oversight authority. They did not sit. They stood at the entrance to the alcove and delivered their communication standing, which was an atmospheric signal I categorized correctly as I heard it. They said that my observations had been reviewed, and that the absence of observable mechanism was consistent with incomplete instrumentation rather than genuine absence of cause. They said that the conclusion I had drawn regarding sustenance function was not supportable by the evidence I had presented, because the evidence was observational rather than mechanistic and therefore insufficient for a functional conclusion. They said that the historical records I had cited had been reviewed in their original context, and that the pattern I had identified in them was a result of confirmation bias in my analytical approach. They said all of this without raising their voice or altering their pace. They were not angry. They were correcting. They said that certain aspects of my report were incompatible with the study's authorized framework, and that the relevant sections would be amended before the report was filed. They said that the preliminary data I had collected would be retained but reclassified. They said that my notation scrolls were to be submitted to the facility archivist by the end of the current shift interval. I submitted the notation scrolls. The data wafer with the archive records was also recovered. I had not been asked to return it, but a facility servitor arrived at my alcove within the hour to collect it. This was not unusual. This was standard. 2 shift cycles later, I was informed that I was to report for a short medical assessment. This was routine within the facility, applied to all personnel assigned to high-threat specimen studies. I reported to the medical station in a different area of the bastion, a level above the subvault complex, with different lighting and different atmospheric composition, and none of the particular quality of pressure that the subvault environment carried. The medical station was staffed by 2 chirurgeons of higher grade than my own designation. They were professional and unhurried. I was asked to sit in a standard assessment chair, and the assessment began. The memory sanction protocol was not described to me as such during the assessment. I became aware of its character approximately midway through the 3rd procedure, when I noticed that the neural interface attachments being applied were not standard metabolic monitoring equipment. I had worked with metabolic monitoring equipment. These were of a different type. I was not permitted to speak during the procedure. One of the chirurgeons, the one managing the interface unit, explained before the procedure began that I was to remain still and was not to vocalize. I remained still. I did not vocalize. The experience of the memory sanction is difficult to describe in terms that are temporally coherent because its primary effect is on the temporal organization of memory, and the experience of it therefore does not leave a clear sequential record. What I can describe is this. There were things I had known, things that were present as organized knowledge in my mind, and during the procedure the organization of some of those things was altered. The alteration was not experienced as loss in the way that deletion is sometimes described. It was experienced as something softer than that, a kind of loosening of the connective tissue between related pieces of knowledge, so that the pieces remained but their relationships to each other were disrupted. A sentence without its grammar, data without its context. When the procedure concluded, the senior chirurgeon reviewed a readout from the interface unit and confirmed the outcome to her colleague in a voice I could hear. She said, "Within acceptable parameters." I was informed that certain conclusions I had drawn during the observation study had been based on analytical errors that were not my fault, but were a known risk of extended proximity to certain xeno specimens, that these specimens were capable of inducing distorted pattern perception in human observers, and that the medical correction I had just received would address the perceptual errors and restore my analytical function to baseline. I accepted this account. I want to record clearly that I accepted it, not under duress in the active sense of the word, but because the account was coherent and was delivered by persons in positions of appropriate authority, and because certain things that I was trying to recall in order to evaluate the account were no longer accessible in the form they would have needed to be in order to serve as a basis for disagreement. The Drukhari, I was informed, had been transferred from sub-facility Umbral to another location. I was not given the destination. I was told that the study had been concluded and that the specimen's transfer was consistent with standard practice for high-threat subjects following the study phase. I was reassigned on the same day. My new assignment was within the Bastion's lower servitor preparation bays, 2 levels below the subvault complex. The role was described in the reassignment notation as appropriate to my current certification level and medical status. Servitor preparation was a function I had not previously performed in a dedicated capacity, though the procedures involved were consistent with my training: surgical stabilization, neural interface application, cognitive reduction protocols, and ongoing viability maintenance throughout the conversion process. The role was precise. It required the same attention to physiological parameters, the same calibration of intervention thresholds, the same assessment of subject responses throughout extended procedures. It was detailed work. It was work I could perform correctly. The preparation bays were efficiently organized. Each subject was logged by intake number and progressed through a standardized sequence of procedures that would reduce a human individual to a functional servitor unit over a period that varied with the complexity of the intended servitor. Designation. Simple utility servitors required less preparation than those designated for cognitive auxiliary functions. The timeline for each subject was documented at intake, and the preparation team's function was to maintain the subject within the necessary parameters throughout the conversion sequence. I was assigned to the monitoring and intervention role, which meant that my function was to observe the subject's physiological status throughout each phase of the preparation and to intervene when the status deviated from the parameters required for the next phase to proceed. This was precise work. The parameters were narrow. The consequences of deviation were a delay in the preparation timeline, which produced inefficiency in the bay's throughput, and thoroughness was therefore valued. I was thorough. The first days of the reassignment were occupied with orientation to the bay's specific protocols and the preparation team's working methods. I reviewed the intake logs and the procedure sequences and mapped these against my existing training. The alignment was substantial. Most of the procedures were ones I had performed in Medicaid contexts, and the modifications required for the servitor preparation context were adjustments of degree rather than kind. I noticed, in the second week, that some of the subjects in the later stages of preparation were exhibiting responses that the standard preparation parameters did not account for. These subjects were maintaining a level of awareness throughout the procedure that was above what the preparation sequence was designed to produce at those stages. The awareness manifested in the behavioral responses, in sustained reactivity to stimulus, and in evidence of ongoing cognitive engagement that should have been reduced by the procedures already applied. The standard protocol response to this deviation was to escalate the cognitive reduction measures. I reviewed the protocol and confirmed this. I applied the escalation in several early cases. The escalation produced the expected reduction in awareness. The subjects transitioned into the expected state, and the preparation sequence continued within parameters. In a later case, I did not escalate immediately. The reason I recorded for the delay was that I was assessing whether the deviation was within a range that might self-correct without intervention as a matter of procedural efficiency. I gave the delay a time window. I monitored the subject throughout the delay window. The awareness did not self-correct. During the delay window, I performed monitoring work. I adjusted my observation position to allow closer assessment of the subject's specific response patterns. I noted the quality of the awareness that was persisting. I made observations about its character. The delay window extended slightly beyond the time I had initially assigned to it, because the observations I was making were producing data that seemed relevant to my assessment function. I logged this as extended assessment time. When I finally applied the escalation, the awareness reduced and the preparation sequence resumed. I did not note how long the delay had been. In subsequent cases involving the same deviation pattern, I observed the same behavior from myself. A period of extended assessment that had the form of evaluation, but in practice allowed the deviation to persist for a duration that was longer than the protocol required. Each time, I logged the period as assessment time. Each time, the assessment produced observations that I entered into my notation. I did not enter the full content of these observations into the formal notation. I entered a summary that reflected standard monitoring language. The fuller observations I kept in my personal log, which was a notation pad I had not submitted with my formal scrolls. In the personal log, I was recording things about the character of prolonged awareness in subjects undergoing extreme procedural stress. I was noting qualitative aspects of the physiological state, the specific parameters that corresponded to the most sustained versions of the awareness, the threshold relationships between different variables. I was noting what produced the longest duration at the most complete level of awareness. I was not ordered to produce these observations. No one had requested this data. The methods I was using to produce the observations were ones I had developed over the course of the servitor preparation assignment, refined from what I had been doing before, and refined further from what I had been doing before that, in the subvault, during the observation study. There were things I did not remember about the observation study, specific conclusions, specific conversations, specific moments of understanding. These absences were documented in my reassignment notes as a result of the medical correction. The medical correction had been appropriate, and I had been told that my analytical function had been restored to baseline. But the baseline that had been restored was not the one I had arrived at the facility with. That baseline no longer existed anywhere I could reach it. The baseline that had been restored was one that contained the habits I had developed during the study without the framework of understanding that had originally accounted for those habits. The observations I was recording in my personal log were not being generated by my understanding of why prolonged awareness had value. They were being generated by an intuition that it did, an intuition that had no source I could locate. It had the character of professional knowledge, the kind of knowledge that a practitioner develops over years of practice and that expresses itself as skill rather than as stated principle. I knew how to produce certain outcomes, and I knew which outcomes to produce, and I did not know why I knew these things. The faith I had carried into this assignment had not been removed by the medical correction. It was still present. I still recited the catechisms when the shift began, still oriented my work toward the service of the Imperium, still understood myself as a professional functioning within a sanctioned and meaningful system. But faith that had once clarified, now obscured. Where it had previously given shape to observation, organizing what I saw into a framework that made sense of everything, it now moved in front of observation, preventing certain forms of seeing from completing themselves. I would begin to notice a pattern, and the faith would arrive before the pattern was finished, and place a label on it: correct, consistent, obedient, and the label would satisfy the noticing function and move my attention onward. The label was always true in the formal sense. The pattern was always real. But the faith prevented the completion of the noticing, which meant that the pattern was labeled without being understood, and the label substituted for the understanding. This was functional. The work continued. The preparation bay's throughput remained within acceptable parameters. My performance reviews, when they occurred, noted precision and thoroughness. In the evenings, after shift, I reviewed my personal log. The data in it was accumulating. The qualitative observations about sustained awareness, about the threshold relationships, about the specific variables that produced the most durable and most complete states, were building into a body of knowledge that had the shape of a system. Not a formalized system, not one I had deliberately constructed, but one that had emerged from the accumulated observations in the way that patterns emerge from sufficient data. I had not analyzed this system explicitly. I had not identified its relationship to the Drukhari's methodology. I did not remember the Drukhari's methodology in the form I had understood it during the study. But the system I was building in my personal log was not different from that methodology in any structural respect. The principles were the same. The outcomes being optimized for were the same. The techniques were derived from the same underlying logic. I did not know this. I could not know it in the way that requires explicit memory to establish the connection. But the pattern was there, and patterns do not require understanding to persist. They require only the continued behavior of the person who has internalized them. The work continued. In the preparation bays, on a shift that I would not be able to date precisely within the larger sequence of my service there, I was monitoring a subject in an extended state of preparation when I noted a deviation that followed the pattern I had been observing in previous cases. The awareness was above expected parameters. The subject was in a state that my personal log's accumulated observations had characterized as the most productive threshold range. I did not begin the extended assessment period I had used in previous cases. I made an adjustment to the procedure parameters directly. I modified a setting in the neural interface unit that the preparation protocol specified for this stage, adjusting it within the operational range in a way that would extend the current threshold state rather than reduce it. The adjustment was within the range of settings authorized for my role. The setting I moved it to was not outside the authorized parameters. I recorded the adjustment as a calibration for individual subject response variation. This was the language I had used in earlier cases. It was accurate in the technical sense that all calibrations within authorized parameters are technically legitimate calibrations. The subject remained in the threshold state for the duration I maintained the adjusted setting. I recorded observations in my personal log throughout this period. When I returned the setting to the standard parameter, the preparation sequence continued normally. I made a final notation in my personal log for that shift and closed it. The screaming that occurred in the preparation bay during procedures was not unusual. It was expected at certain stages, quantified in the preparation protocol as a behavioral response consistent with the subject's current state, and not categorized as an indicator of procedural error in and of itself. The relevant protocol section noted that vocalization during preparation was subject-dependent and that the absence of vocalization was not necessarily preferable to its presence. What mattered was the physiological status beneath the behavioral expression. I had learned, in the course of my work in the Bay, to read the difference between vocalizations that indicated a preparation sequence was proceeding correctly and those that indicated a problem requiring intervention. This was a skill. It was a professional skill that I had developed through practice, as all professional skills are developed. The screaming, when it occurred, was data. I noted its onset, its duration, its intensity relative to the subject's current preparation stage, and its relationship to the monitored physiological parameters. I noted when it aligned with expected profiles and when it deviated. I noted the deviations in my personal log with the same level of detail I had been applying to the awareness observations, and over time I had also developed an understanding of which vocalizations corresponded to the threshold states I had been observing and preserving. These vocalizations had a specific character. I knew this character the way you know a clinical signature, the specific pattern of a symptom that tells you what you are observing before you have completed the formal diagnostic process. I knew it without being able to account for how I had come to know it, and this did not trouble me in the way it should have. The preparation bay was not the sub-vault. The lighting was warmer. The equipment was standard Imperium issue rather than the specialized apparatus of the Ordo Xenos facility above. The subjects were human, and their reduction to servitor function was a sanctioned and necessary operation that served the Imperium directly and unambiguously. None of this was untrue. All of it was accurate. The bay was different from the sub-vault in every way that I could verify. But the work I was doing in the bay, the specific decisions I was making about thresholds and durations and the quality of awareness I was maintaining and the reasons I was maintaining it, was not different from the work I'd watched being done in the sub-vault. From the position of the recorder who was documenting it, before I had understood what I was documenting. I did not know this. I want to be precise about that, because precision is the only thing I can offer. The knowledge that would have allowed me to know this had been removed. What remained was the practice, and the practice continued without the knowledge. The way a body continues functions it was trained for after the mind that understood those functions has been altered. The faith remained, the doctrine was intact, the catechisms were recited at the start of each shift. It did not matter what I believed. The belief and the behavior had separated, and the behavior was running on its own guidance now, and the guidance was something I had absorbed in a sealed subvault over a single extended study cycle and could no longer fully locate. I continued the work. The preparation bay required precision and thoroughness, and I provided both. My supervision of the threshold states was noted by the facility's monitoring systems as efficient maintenance within protocol parameters. The notation was accurate. In the evenings, I reviewed my personal log and added to it. The body of observations grew. The system within it became more refined. I did not analyze the system because analysis required the explicit identification of what the observations were about, and the explicit identification would have required the connection that the medical correction had severed. The connection did not exist.